Good afternoon. My name's Anna Demant and I'm a member of the AIDEN Committee, the Australian International Development Network. AIDEN's driving the case for global giving. We want to see more giving and more informed giving to overseas communities. Today is one in a series of country updates we're running in an attempt to give us all a bearing on how best to support communities as they grapple with crisis upon crisis in this pandemic-informed world. Acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Today, ABC investigative journalist Dan Oakes will be in conversation with 4 people who are well acquainted with Afghanistan. And together we'll seek clear guidance on how best to support people facing a triple threat from the pandemic, drought, and the resurgence of the Taliban in the face of troop withdrawals. We'll hear from Najeeba Wazefedost, who together with her family, and at the age of 10, sought asylum from Australia at sea. She came here with no English, but by 14 had won a national essay writing contest. She's since gone on to be a driving force in the global push for a participation revolution for refugees and was a founding member of the Global Refugee-led Network. Najeeba founded APNOR, or Asia Pacific Network for Refugees, to establish a voice for refugee leaders in our region. Ali Reza Yunespour also arrived in Australia from Afghanistan with no English, but a few years later was voted school captain in his New South Wales high school. Ali has a PhD from ANU on the Afghan tertiary system. He works at Melbourne University for his day job while on the side managing a program supporting school programs in Hazara provinces of Afghanistan. His work with Indigo Foundation has directly improved the lives of thousands of Hazara school children, particularly women teachers and girls. And then we have Dr. Nishank Motwani, who's based in Kabul, was based in Kabul, working with ATR Consulting, the premier consulting firm in the country concerned with governance, conflict and development. He's conducted research programs assessing the effectiveness and impact of governance and development programs in 30 of the 34 provinces in the country. Nishank is now based in Canberra and is a globally recognised and widely published and quoted expert on Afghanistan. And then finally, not least, but finally, we have Naomi Steer, who's the founding National Director of Australia for UNHCR, the private sector national partner for the UN Refugee Agency. Naomi is a former diplomat with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade with postings to the United Nations in New York and India. She's had a long-standing interest in the country, having covered it for DFAT in the 1980s during the Soviet occupation and visiting again in 2002 for UNHCR to document and tell the story of some of the 1.7 million refugees who returned to the country following the overthrow of the Taliban regime. Since then, she's been incredibly successful at encouraging Australians to donate and support UNHCR's ongoing humanitarian operations. So today, Dan Oakes will facilitate the discussion. As an experienced broadcast journalist, he's well placed to do so. However, before that, Dan, I've got a few questions for you. 10 years ago, as Dan was a journalist embedded with Australian troops in Orange province, in June 2019, however, he himself became an international news story, famously, together with his producer Sam Clark, when Australian Federal Police raided ABC headquarters with a warrant to look for sources for a story called The Afghan Files, detailing suspected abuses against unarmed Afghan civilians by Australian soldiers. It took almost another year before the government announced that they were dropping charges against Dan, even though they believed they could mount a successful case against him. Dan, why do you think the charges against you were dropped?
Well, thanks, Anna. They made it very clear that the reason that they didn't proceed with charges against me and against my producer, Sam, was that they, as they described it, it was not in the public interest for them to pursue charges against us. However, they did make it very clear when they did drop the charges that if they had pursued charges against us, that they were pretty confident they would have got a conviction. So someone somewhere decided that it wasn't in the public interest that we be convicted. I can only assume that's because obviously evidence has subsequently emerged of alleged war crimes that have been committed, and it would have been a very bad look to obviously prosecute people who were bringing those matters to light. You know, thankfully that was the case. As we sit here today, those charges are no longer hanging over my head.
A huge relief for you, your family, and those who care about you. But for you, you know, even 10 years ago when you were in Afghanistan, at the time you found it really hard to get a read on exactly why the troops were there. No one really could explain to you what the mission was. Was that a shock for you at the time?
I guess at the time it was surprising. In retrospect, it's not surprising. At the time, it was somewhat surprising. I guess we were all a bit more innocent and naive back in 2010, 2011. Yeah, at the time, it was surprising that people seemed to have very little idea about what exactly it was we were doing there and what it was we were hoping to achieve. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, it's not so surprising, but at the time, yes, it was quite shocking to talk to people over there, to Australian Defence Force personnel and some Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade personnel, and to realise that we really didn't have much of an idea about precisely what it was we were hoping to achieve by our presence there.
So you would have used translators while you were there. Again, I'm wondering whether you're surprised that there wasn't a more immediate and clear plan in the recent months to evacuate people like this, clearly compromised by the troop withdrawals.
I think that so much of what's happened has happened in an ad hoc fashion and made up being made up as it's gone along. I think that probably what has happened there has happened so swiftly with the Taliban taking control of so many districts. I think people here probably didn't even turn their attention to what was going to be the fate of those interpreters and other local staff who assisted us over there. I think people probably didn't even turn their attention to what was going to happen to them. And it's really been thrust upon them so quickly, so rapidly in the last few weeks and months. No provisions were made, no thought was given, and only now are they really being forced to think about it. We've seen, obviously, other countries appear to have been more proactive in granting those types of visas. I can only hope on a personal level that our government really looks after those people, those interpreters and those locally employed staff that helped us over there.
Someone who's certainly turning her attention to what's happening in Afghanistan right now and how best to assist is Naomi Steer. I'll now hand over to you, Dan, to facilitate a conversation with Naomi and our other guests.
Thanks, Anna. So, Naomi, if possible, could you, I'd be keen to hear, I suppose, just a bit of a potted version of your previous experience with Afghanistan. I know you go back a long way with the country and you have, some significant previous experience with Afghanistan.
Yes, thanks, Dan. And I should say thanks to the other panellists, Najeeba, Nishank and Ali Reza. It's a real privilege to be on the panel with you. And also thank you to Aidan and the Wheeler Foundation for including Australia for UNHCR. When I go back, I sort of think I've been around for a while now, Dan, because we're talking the 80s, when I was posted to India with Foreign Affairs as a young diplomat. And it was probably one of the first times I really sort of came face to face with refugee situations. I lived in New Delhi, and at that time there were many Afghan refugees in Delhi, and of course in the region generally. At that time, people remember and cast their minds back. It was actually the Soviet-backed regime in power in Afghanistan, which caused, I guess, the first big wave of Afghan refugee movements out of the country. And indeed, many of the people I think that may be joining this webinar today came in that first resettlement of refugees to Australia, escaping from that situation. I actually wasn't allowed into Afghanistan at that time because we didn't recognise the government, but I went up to Peshawar in late '87 and interviewed a number of the Mujahideen leaders. As we knew then, it was probably quite unusual for a woman at that time. But for those of us who remember, Green Hotel was this sort of seminal hotbed of intrigue where you had diplomats and spies and Mujahideen, and sort of a sense of sort of change, I guess, but the sort of great adventure, you know, for I think, you know, some others, how it was considered. Moving forward, 15 years or so later, I was working with Australia for UNHCR, and UNHCR asked me to go back in 2002, about 6 months after the Taliban regime had been toppled by the US-led forces, to document the really unanticipated return of millions of Afghan refugees to their home country. And I think, Anna, you mentioned in the space, you know, in that the space of sort of 6 months in 2002, between, I think it was March and October, something like 1.7 million refugees returned to Afghanistan. So I was there with a Australian cameraman, Tony Wilson, sort of literally landing at the border in Pakistan and up in the northwest transition points with Iran, interviewing people returning. And I just remember I guess the optimism people had. I think, as anyone knows the history of Afghanistan, Afghans, and you will see it here with our speakers today, are incredibly kind of strong and resilient people, and they have had to be. And people were sort of coming back knowing it would be hard. But, you know, as one woman said to me on the Herat border, you know, coming back, and she expected a little America. But, you know, so there was this sort of optimism. People were really sort of voting with their feet, you know, pride in their country. And, you know, I just remember it as this sort of window of opportunity. Sadly, what happened 12 months later, the Iraq war broke out, and suddenly all the world attention moved to that situation and away from Afghanistan. And I really think the momentum that had been there and that I'd sort of witnessed and felt in 2002 had been lost to some extent as a sort of world focus shifted elsewhere, and most importantly, world, you know, resources and development resources. That being said, I should just note, in the sort of since 2002, I think nearly 6 million people have gone back to Afghanistan. I think which is one of the largest repatriation exercises ever in the history of the UN Refugee Agency. And so now you're having in Afghanistan quite a sort of complex situation. You've got, you know, over 2 million refugees outside the country. 90% of those are hosted in Pakistan and Iran. You have about 3 million people now displaced internally, and that's sort of escalating with the current conflict. And then you have this body of people who have returned, who, you know, when I was meeting people, often, you know, they had been out of the country for 20 years, living in Pakistan. They were returning to the house in Kabul. It had been occupied by others in that time, or other people returning to the country. So lots of issues there about how you integrate back into a country that kind of large population.
Yeah, that was, you know, my next question was going to be, you know, how do you address this double responsibility really of external displacement, but also internal reintegration? It's obviously a really, really thorny thorny issue because, you know, with the Taliban obviously seemingly creeping closer to taking over large parts of the country. I mean, how do you internally reintegrate people as well, and also deal with this external displacement?
Yeah, and I think I think when I should say, when I say that there's sort of been, I guess, the sort of focus or of resources directed elsewhere, there actually has been, I think, a really, what would you say, sort of extensive collaborative effort by UN, by its partners, by NGOs. Najeeba, I know, and Nishank, for example, you know, have been very involved in some of those activities. I think in terms of the priorities, you know, and certainly when I was there, and that's continued. It's about land, property, education, and livelihoods and health services, because after many years fighting, even up to 2002, you know, Afghanistan was really left with very limited infrastructure in many areas. And that's really been the sort of focus of the international community over the last 18 years, to really try and rebuild that infrastructure. And there have been successes in a number of parts of the country. And I'm sure the Kabul that I visited in 2002, which was really very bombed, you know, it was looked like one of those images from the Second World War, where you have just sort of rows of bombed out buildings and whatever. My friends who visited, you know, since then, you know, it's quite a bustling city, quite cosmopolitan, you know, big traffic jams, all the things that you get with the good and the bad of urbanisation, but a transformation there around the cities. But of course, it's the rural areas, and Afghanistan is not alone in this. It happens in many countries, that really, in terms of the delivery of services, has been most lacking.
So can you, we touched on this when we were speaking the other day, but what's the intentions with the United Nations, you know, with the Taliban looking like it is obviously going to, I mean, it has taken control of large parts of the country. What are the United Nations intentions and the UNHCR regarding its presence in the country?
For UNHCR, you know, I guess it's been committed to staying and working in Afghanistan over 5 decades now, and that will continue. So, you know, all the representations are, of course, at this critical time, it's even more important that we stay and deliver. Of course, as an agency, as anybody working in Afghanistan at the moment is aware, you know, a difficult security situation, difficult logistics. But I have to say, for UNHCR, that's probably not an unusual situation for that agency, our agency, to operate in. It is a frontline organisation. So for UNHCR, it certainly is committed to staying and delivering, and to support, you know, the millions of citizens who are caught in the conflict, as they have been over time, but especially at this critical time, to stay and support.
And of course, you know, one extremely important aspect to all this, and something that weighs very heavily on everyone's mind, is the fate of women and girls in Afghanistan. I mean, you know, what are your views on what the international community generally and what the UNHCR specifically can do to safeguard the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan in the immediate future and the long-term future?
Well, over the last 2 decades, UNHCR, together with other partners, has really worked to elevate the status of women and girls in Afghanistan. UNHCR is responsible in particular around protection, and also the shelter cluster, I should say that. And there are other agencies, for example, that UNICEF that lead on education and other areas. But it's been really critical, I guess, to support women and girls. And again, For UNHCR, 80% of refugees worldwide are women and girls. So it's a focus of what we do. It's core to what we do. Protection around sexual and gender-based violence, assault, domestic violence, the positive side of support through education and livelihoods. And again, this is not only because of the current situation there, re the conflict, we're also, of course, facing a pandemic. Less than 1% of people in Afghanistan have actually been vaccinated. And that, of course, is another challenge and exacerbates the sort of vulnerabilities of people, and particularly women and girls. So that has been a key focus of UNHCR work. And I think Ali or Najeeba and Nishank might also talk about some of the progress. I won't go into that, but I know education has sort of been, there's a lot more that can be done, but there has been significant increases in girls' access to education, which of course is really positive. And of course, we're all concerned that that continue. In terms of what we can do as the international community and the UN, and it's been very vocal, as has our Secretary General Antonio Guterres, calling on all parties to respect human rights, calling on all parties to respect the rights of women and girls. And I think that has to be kept at the forefront of the global community as really important. I think as we were talking the other day, it's really important women's voices be represented in any peace process or discussions or negotiations about the way forward in Afghanistan.
Well, I'll turn to, thanks very much, Naomi, and I'll turn to Ali Reza Yunespour now from the School of Social and Political Sciences at Melbourne Uni, and also from the Indigo Foundation of Australia. If we're talking specifically about girls and education, Ali, if you could maybe tell us a little bit about your recent work in Afghanistan with the Indigo Foundation, I'd be really appreciative.
Thank you, Dan. And it's really good to be part of this panel and also see many people who have joined us. Thank you for joining this session. Let me start with our work. Of course, Indigo Foundation has been working in Afghanistan since 2003. We started a small project with a textbook on the request of a community in Ghazni province, and that project, of course, has continued until today. We have been able to support around 8,000 children in 23 different schools by building a school building, providing desks and chairs, but of course, providing support for female teachers. And from those communities, around 800 students have gone to university. Some of them have, of course, returned back to their communities as school principals and teachers. But more broadly, I think what's happening in Afghanistan is that education and the development of education has been a key success, we call, or progress of what happened in the past 20 years. I, for example, could reflect a time in the 1990s when girls were banned from attending schools and universities. And of course, after 2001 and 2002, at one point, around 9 million children were in schools. Today would be about 6 million. And of course, about 30 to 35% of them are girls. At a higher education institutions, the same, around over 400,000 students are attending universities or higher education institutions in Kabul and in the provinces. And of course, more than half of those students are at the private higher education institution. Now, if we think of the history of higher education in Afghanistan, which something that I wrote about in my thesis, is that we did not have a private education at all in the country. So all of those institutions have developed since 2001 and 2002. And so, yeah, significant progress have been made. Of course, there are still challenges. The one of those challenges, of course, is inequitable access to education. We've got some provinces, especially in the south and the east of the country, with no girls attending high schools. We've got some universities, for example, in southern and eastern part of the country with no girls attending any of the faculties across in those provinces. And of course, the other challenge is that security. And the rise of insurgency that started in 2005 and 6, and of course it has come to an episode today that we sadly see that some districts have fallen to the Taliban in recent months, and of course they've intensified their violence on major city centers. These are critical dangers to what has been achieved in Afghanistan, but I might take this opportunity to remind our friends and people who are here with us that this conflict in Afghanistan has been going on for 40 years. It had different episodes into it, and the ugly episode that we see in the past few months are something that everyone to question what was happening and what is happening to this country, and of course what is at danger now if Afghanistan would be abandoned at this critical time of its history.
Yeah, well, my next question was going to be, what message would you send to the international community at a time when things look so precarious there in Afghanistan, and it looks like, all of the signs are the Taliban are creeping closer and closer to gaining substantial control? It would be an easy thing for the international community to lose heart, I suppose, and to lose faith in Afghanistan. What would you say to people who have an interest in the country?
My point about the international community in Afghanistan is that Afghanistan's recent history, particularly I think the past 20 years, is the history of the world in many ways. This is where major powers have been part of it, both in the positive and ugly side of it. So I think it's really important to take responsibility for what has been happening in Afghanistan. I think what happened last year with the US signing a peace agreement with the Taliban, in my view, the only political, the only group whose leadership is still in the UN sanction list, but they've got a peace agreement with the Taliban, with the United States. I think that legitimacy really emboldened the Taliban's narrative. It allowed them to increase their violence and give them this, perceived hope that they could win militarily and rule Afghanistan. I think at this time, what are the encouraging signs in response to that is, as we see the withdrawal of the international security forces that would be completed this month, there are encouraging signs that are happening inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan. Inside Afghanistan, we've seen a significant number of men and women who have taken arms against the Taliban. They have raised their voices through social media. And of course, the past 2 nights in Kabul, in Herat, in Lashkargah, in major city centers of Afghanistan, people have come out on the roofs of their homes, on the streets, calling, chanting Allah Akbar, which is, God is great, but this is in support of the Afghan security forces. This is in support of the education of women. This is in support of the institutions that have been created in Afghanistan. And I think, in my view, that should have happened 15 years ago. That should have happened in the south and the east of the country, perhaps 10 years ago. But it's definitely a time now, a challenge to the Taliban's message. And why that matters in the Taliban's narrative is that Taliban's continually running this narrative in the past year or so that people are welcoming us in the districts. In fact, what we are seeing is this strong resistance against those narrative, and I think that resistance should be supported by the international community alongside the Afghan government. The other thing that the international community should do is that it should avoid putting pressure on the Afghan government, as it did in the past 18 months, to accept the Taliban's demand. Now, the Talibans are demanding a continued release of 7,000 prisoners. And of course, they're asking the Afghan government and the international community to, to ask the UN to get their leadership out of the UN sanction list. Unless the Taliban commit to some form of ceasefire or commit to a political settlement in Afghanistan, it would be a dangerous path to walk. We've seen that, what happened with the 5,000 prisoners released last year when the Afghan government were pushed and forced to do that. All of those 5,000, the majority of them have gone into those fighting fronts now in the districts and the provinces. So, and of course, the other thing the international community is to have a united voice, as Naomi was saying, to defend us, human rights atrocities that are happening across Afghanistan. And of course, I'm encouraged on one level also to see that the international community are supporting, interpreters, locally engaged staff, women, people who are at immediate risk from Afghanistan to come. But the reality is that the majority of Afghans will remain in Afghanistan, as it has been the case for the past 40 plus years. My hope is that the international community continue to support the people of Afghanistan inside Afghanistan.
Thanks very much, Ali Reza. I'll move to Dr. Nishank Motwani now, who I believe studied with you and was, until very recently, in Kabul, Director of Research and Policy at ATR Consulting in Kabul. Are you there, Nishank? Can you hear me?
Hi, Dan. Thank you very much for the introduction. And yes, Ali Reza and I are friends, and we did our PhDs together. Yes.
Can you just give us just a little bit of an idea of what your experience in Afghanistan is and what you've done there, basically? Sure.
Just to echo some of Ali's points, my experience in Afghanistan has been, I've been working in different capacities there. Went there first in 2012, and then over the years have served as an elections observer in my independent capacity, monitoring the two different presidential elections in 2014 and 2019, and the parliamentary elections in 2018. And one of the key things about monitoring those elections was that when I had a chance to speak to people in different provinces was that they'd come out to vote and vote in favor of who they want their leaders to be, meaning that there's that direct linkage between the people who are coming out to vote and elected representatives in defiance of Taliban threats, in defiance of Taliban attacks. And I remember speaking to people in these long snaking lines. Why are they out here today? Is because they said, we don't want the Taliban to be running our lives. They're not accountable to anyone except to Pakistan. Whereas we want leaders that we can change, and voting is that mechanism that allows us to do that change. And after they casted their vote, they would leave the polling station with an ink mark on their finger showing that they voted, and posting pictures of themselves indicating how proud they are that they have voted. And that memory and witnessing that is going to stay with me for the rest of my life, because it shows that the idea of that peaceful transfer of power has very much embedded now over the last 20 years in Afghanistan.
So you don't think necessarily that it is a fait accompli that the Taliban is going to take control of Afghanistan, because that's the way that people are speaking at the moment, that it's almost inevitable the Taliban will take control of Afghanistan?
I don't think the outcome is predetermined in that sense. And there are a few things that would have to go very much in the Taliban's favor. One is the creeping invasion that has been happening in Afghanistan over the last many decades, but has certainly amplified over the last months, but particularly since the signing of the Doha peace process last year. It effectively gave the Taliban everything that they wanted, which was an exit date of the international forces, legitimization by the international community and the United States, no pressure to have a ceasefire, a release of prisoners, and the idea that they were going to be forming some kind of interim government, or indeed a government of their own. And that has injected in them this ferociousness in which they have been capturing increasing territory. That being said, the Afghan forces, and especially the special forces, have been fighting back the Taliban advances. And it's true, the Afghan National Army, which is incredibly stretched without the backing of the international military forces, are on the backhand at this point. And they aren't going to be able to protect every single district in the country, because that would stretch them even further. So what they are doing is centering around major populations centers such as Lashkar-Gah, Kandahar, Herat, and other places, so that they are not overtaken by the Taliban. The Taliban, for them to seize power, would need to precipitate a collapse of the ANA, or at least peeling away a large units or a cause from the ANA. And that psychological impact, if it were to happen like that, would add increasing pressure on the Afghan government that its days would be numbered. Secondly, if they were to capture any of the major cities in the south, their own birthplace, and particularly in the south, that also would send a very significant message to the Afghan government, as well as to the international community, that they are a force, that they are an unstoppable force. That hasn't happened yet, and the Afghan government is very determined to ensure that Lashkar-Gah, Kandahar, Herat do not fall to the Taliban.
So what does the current situation in Afghanistan mean for the flow of foreign aid into that country? What difficulties does it pose?
There's a significant degree of difficulties. While I was in Kabul, one of the things that was criticized was that for a range of international development partners and their local implementing agencies on the ground, they would have to negotiate access with the Taliban and surreptitiously pay the Taliban taxes in order to gain access to those areas. Those actions themselves had served to legitimate the Taliban, solidify their presence, and mean that whatever little leverage, if there was any to begin with, was lost, because the Taliban, it gave them that tacit approval that they were the ones who are controlling those particular areas. Now, if we move to where we are currently, it's incredibly difficult for international actors for that particular aid to flow to the intended beneficiaries on the ground, because much of the beneficiaries on the ground have been displaced due to the significant degree of fighting that is taking place. A lot of the programs that I'm aware of, particularly to do with women's empowerment, economic empowerment in the north and south of the country, are no longer operating or have been temporarily suspended because the Taliban have seized control of those areas. And the last thing probably the Taliban would want is to have a program that is about empowering women or advancing women's education. They are diametrically opposite to both of those goals, which are part of the international community's goals to advance Afghanistan's SDGs.
So, I mean, I'm aware that it's a very broad question, but what should the international community or aid donors be doing at the time? I mean, how should they be targeting their aid, and what should they be doing at this point in time?
I think in terms of targeting aid, it would be a bit difficult right now, but I think the core focus would be to maintain the support. Do not withdraw the support. It's very easy for international actors to reach the conclusion that given the significant scale of the fighting and the intensity of fighting, that perhaps our efforts and aid money are better used somewhere else. I think that would be a poor signal, and it would suck out the oxygen and that momentum that has been built over 20 years in the country at significant cost. So maintain and sustain that aid, see where aid can still flow by listening to partners on the ground. Too often, aid comes in as a parachute without much realization of the context. So speak to people on the ground about where that aid should be directed to, and especially in areas of healthcare, education, economic programs, which really helps us sustain livelihoods and build livelihoods. Those should be continued where aid can still reach the people, but in partnership with people on the ground.
Right. Thank you very much, Nishank. Really appreciate that. And we'll turn now to Najeeba Wazefedost. Can you hear me, Najeeba?
Yes, I can, Dan.
How are you?
Good, thank you.
So you arrived here in Australia as an asylum seeker, and you've become a very strong and eloquent voice for refugees in the region. what does the current situation in Afghanistan mean for people seeking refuge, both internally and externally from that country?
Sure. Thank you, Dan. In ACNUR, in the Asia Pacific Network of Refugees, we actually held continuous and regular dialogue with our members across Asia, including Afghanistan. And there has been 3 significant issues which the community has raised to us. I think the first issue, which we've heard from all the speakers, is displacement. We've experienced 40 years of displacement in Afghanistan, and more than ever, we actually see the number of human sufferings and newly displaced within the country is really on rise again. And we've heard from Ali Reza, we heard from Nishank saying exactly the same thing. And this is really in addition to COVID ravaging in the country, drought displacement, which was declared by the government in 2021, the food insecurity, and the large number of returns. People right now currently being forced to flee again, both internally and abroad. Many Afghans from the provinces, which is currently under the threat of the Taliban, have either already moved internally, or they're basically trying to find the means available to leave the country into countries like Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, Tajikistan, or elsewhere. So that's the first issue. The second issue that we hear again continuously, and something that we've been hearing again from our other speakers, and I need to emphasize much more, is the worst security situation ever for women and girls in Afghanistan, who really have lost their hope for peace and stability. And once again, we've been hearing from women that they're finding themselves as a prisoner of their own sex. And that means a lot. We know and expect that the Taliban will return to power, either via power sharing deal with the Afghan government or through Shia force. The group already controls around half of the country. Most of the provinces has been overtaken. And there is a widespread fear that if they do, the Taliban will reintroduce its notorious system of gender segregation from when the group ruled in the late 1990s, which barred women and girls, again, from almost everything: work, the right to vote, the right and access to education. And we heard around the numbers and figures from Ali Reza just now. So the question is, what is Australia's role in Afghanistan right now, as women are again put at risk? Does Australia want to see a backslide again, considering the huge investment made and being the single biggest national donor of funds for a program to eliminate violence against women? So right now, I have to say, it's not just the Afghan interpreters who may be in need of emergency visas out of Afghanistan and into Australia. Outspoken women's rights agitators, women politicians, the countless women leaders that we're speaking to, the feminist activists that are involved in ACNUR, they're all raising the security concerns for themselves, especially those that have helped Afghanistan into the 21st century are facing their fights of their lives. So like the interpreters who work for Australia, some of those women also have targets on their back. It's not Taliban's practice to really speak on businesses, politics, or indeed peace with the women. And we don't see any women in the peace negotiation tables. We saw, for the Taliban, women are but God's breeders and domestic furnitures. The good ones remain silent, fully hidden under the black cloth, and the bad women don't. So, and the third and the last issue that again we've heard from our members in ACNUR is that the lack of support by donors directly to local-led organizations in Afghanistan. We know COVID-19 has forced, the adoption of new working practices, highlighted the positive role of local organizations in handling the humanitarian response in Pakistan, in Iran, and Afghanistan, and strengthening the locally led response. Small local organizations, they talk to us all the time, and they say they rarely have access to increased funding. Instead, INGOs prefer partnership with established national organizations. And we have these smaller local organizations that are working in remote areas and are actually the ones that are able to provide and deliver aid in a timely manner, not necessarily having the opportunities for participation. So while remote working created opportunities to increase participation, these gains are still affected by digital inequalities. So my say is that localization has definitely emerged as an important principle in the way forward in order to build on the global momentum in this area.
So all of that said, what does Australia need to do? What do we need to do to safeguard the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan? What's the most effective thing that we can do and people listening here today can do?
Sure. I mean, I have few recommendations. One, countries like Australia should really continue their engagement, especially in terms of funding. Whilst its situation is unclear, ongoing and flexible funding is needed to really plug immediate humanitarian concerns and the nation's development. And when we talk about, increasing funding, then also looking at innovative and flexible ways to support women local-led organizations on the ground. That's probably my first recommendation. And the second thing is that, again, for Australia to consider special protection and resettlement to Afghan women advocates, politicians, and feminists that have been put as at a higher risk, just similar like interpreters, looking at innovative ways of providing protection to those special group of women. And my third recommendation is, again, for Australia to expand its opportunities to advance locally led humanitarian response emerging as a result of COVID-19. We need a long-term system-wide change. The implementation of this action will really require the leadership, investment, and commitment from international actors and donors in close collaboration with local led organizations. So international organizations, or countries like Australia should really take into account the power imbalances that currently exist in their own structure. So, and one thing that I think Australia can do immediately is that, we've got, more than thousands of cases sitting in Australia as Afghan asylum seekers that have lived in limbo and uncertainty for years. And the current situation is a clear testimony that the country, Afghanistan, is not going to be left out of conflict. Its persecution is not going to end. And the least we can do is to provide them immediate protection and looking at ways of, changing their seeking asylum into a permanent protection in Australia, and also looking at ways of supporting, our neighborhood countries like Indonesia, like Malaysia, those that are also hosting Afghan asylum seekers and having no other ways to seek protection than staying in those countries, for a huge time and without having any, certainty into their future.
It seems like there are quite a lot of questions that people want to ask after we've spoken, but I'm just curious, Najeeba, I'm speaking as a journalist now, but do you have a list of women from civil society in Afghanistan, for instance, who you think would be good candidates for visas similar to the interpreters' visas, that a list that you could use to apply pressure to politicians here in Australia?
That's an excellent question. I mean, ACNUR, one thing that we've been trying to do is to map out, the women or the women activists, women feminists, women politicians that have been at huge risk of security in Afghanistan. And we've been, as I said, in regular contact, and we are actually being a close witness of their situation. Definitely, we have a list of those women on the ground that requires that urgent protection. And we would be, and this is the role of the diaspora, I guess. How do we come in use for the Australian government? We've come from that country, we've resettled in this country, and we are in contact with our own families and friends, but more importantly with those through ACNUR, who have been quite of strong advocates in bringing that change in women leadership. So there we are. I think it's about time for us to be used as a resource to the Australian government and produce that list to them as a way to look at of providing protection to those in higher need.
Yeah, I think that would be a very interesting story to pursue. Obviously, we've seen the story of the interpreters gain a lot of traction. I think that it would be a very interesting story to do if there are women who are equally, if not more deserving of visas. I think it would be a very interesting story to do. So that's something that maybe we can discuss after this is over.
And probably, Dan, is my last comment. I think that's where the role of media becomes so important. How do we bring out the voices of the most underrepresented people, and that includes women in Afghanistan? How do we make sure their voices are also heard, in similar to what interpreters have been, portrayed in the media? And I think I guess one of the recommendations that just comes out, how do we involve the media engagement from Australia to bring those voices and to seek and exert pressure on Australian government to provide some sort of protection for those groups?
All right, thank you very much, Najeeba. I think I'm handing back over to Anna now, I believe. Is that right, Anna?
Sure. We do have quite a number of questions in the chat function. We will also if we don't get to all the questions and can't answer them during this session, we will circulate them amongst our panelists and be in touch with follow-up on those. That was a really valuable moment to end on. I think a moment of advocacy there, an opportunity for some great action in terms of documenting people who may be, because of their principled stance over the last decade or so, who may be particularly targeted now under in this current and unstable situation in Afghanistan. And it's a really good segue to a question from Robin Tupman. She's a judge, and she was asking the question on behalf of herself and Justice Susan Glazebrook, who are on the executive of the International Association of Women Judges, and they've got particular concerns for Afghani women judges, and note that 2 female judges were murdered in their court cars on the way to work in January. So it sounds like already there's a start to the work that Najeeba and Dan have ahead of them. Nishank talked about the danger of sucking the energy out of the oxygen out of the incredible gains that have been detailed over this call. You know, Ali Reza talked about the number of people in education. And Naomi talked about how when it all started and she was on the border of Herat, and this amazing feeling of hope and energy in the air. We've got a question around how important it is. I'm just scrolling down to the question. There's quite a few. There was a question from Marcella around public perception, and Ali, would you like to answer that question? I can see you've read it.
Yeah, thank you, and I think that's a really timely question. Thank you, Marcella. I think the public support really matters at this time because, of course, the Afghan conflict, this ugly episode of the recent years have been happening in a globalized world, and Afghanistan is part of that global network. It is different to the 1990s when people could hardly hear what was happening in Afghanistan, and even when, for example, President Najibullah in the 1990s were giving his speech and calling for support for national reconciliation in the 1990s, no one actually, even in the villages and towns, heard his message. When he went, for example, to Belgrade, where the talks between the Pakistani and the Afghan government were happening, and of course the Soviet Union and the US government signed that deal on behalf of the 2 major powers, no one knew about what was happening. But I think today it is about global perception, and this is why I think every citizen, I come back to the question that Dan had as well earlier about what Australia can do. I think there are so much that the Australian government can do, but also so much that the Australian community can do. Every community member who is concerned about human rights atrocities, who is concerned about women's status, gender equity in the world, this is the time to actually speak up. This is the time to actually stand up for those who have no voices. I can't emphasize that I want people who have had the opportunity in Afghanistan, who uses social media, who have been advocate for women and and human rights. Those people could come out of Afghanistan, but my real worry is not about them, really, to be honest. I'm actually worried about millions of people who would be there, who would remain there under all circumstances. They would not go anywhere. I'm aware, I'm afraid that to say this, but I am worried about the life of the interpreters, as many other people. I'm, worried the life of those people who have had, English educations, and they're using, their connections to the rest of the world to raise their voices. But I'm also deeply worried about those who cannot speak. And I recall a meeting just 3 nights ago before, when we had with a group of women in Kabul. And this is a group that we, through Indigo Foundation, would like to, support in the coming years. And I had, a question from them about what they are thinking about these visas that have been announced by the United States for women and, for advocates of women, for interpreters and the rest. And they were saying that, this would just benefit a few. The majority of women will remain in Afghanistan, like the rest of the population. So I think it's important that even though this conflict is ongoing, that every one of us use our power as much as we could to end this violence. And of course, to make sure that this peace negotiation with all of this failure that has started between the Afghan government and the Taliban, that could succeed. I think that's the long-term solution for what's happening in Afghanistan.
Can I just jump in there too, Anna, just briefly, and 2 points, and I think Ali's right, the majority of Afghans are in Afghanistan, and we shouldn't forget that. And so it is continuing that support, I think, at this critical time. I just note UNHCR's emergency response for the region is only 43% funded for 2021, which is extraordinary given what, if there isn't that support and if there isn't that stability, what that means is sort of around displacement. I should also say, with 90% of refugees being hosted in Pakistan and Iran, we also have to continue supporting those countries. And we spoke before this webinar about the importance of the Global Refugee Compact and supporting those countries who host the largest number of refugees, who are often themselves the countries with the least resources. And as we've seen development funds decline globally, including with the Australian government, I think it's really important that we recommit to supporting those countries who have the most need.
Thanks for those comments, Naomi, and an important call to action there. Nishank, I wondered if you had any particular follow-up on the question around on Ali Reza's comments just before, with regards to the importance of people on the ground, people power, and the parallels to, I think the question was around the Arab Spring and whether there's parallels in terms of the use of social media and access of people, particularly in rural and regional areas, to information that previously they didn't have, in previous conflicts they didn't have.
Thank you very much for that question. I'm unable to actually flip through my screen to look at the question, so I'll try and answer it as you've described it. In terms of the digital connectivity, there's been a telecommunications revolution really that's happened in Afghanistan, and that's meant that significant corners of the country and people in even rural areas are better connected in the country than they were 20 years ago. And what that has meant is that, as Ali Reza had mentioned, has allowed the government and the international community's message to reach those people, meaning it's going to be that much harder for the Taliban to challenge and to overturn the gains that have been made over the last 20 years. So there is a degree to which that social media, regular media, print media can play a role, but at the same time, we also need to remember that there's a significant number of the population that is still illiterate. So the messaging that reaches people is for people that are still that have the ability to read and write, and there's still a large number of people who are outside, sitting outside. So it has to be the way in which these messages can be instrumentalized needs to be worked out. But just to the other question of refugee resettlement, the US announced its P2 priority program a couple of days ago. While that's a welcome move, the problem with that program is that it would, number one, requires a US sponsor to an American official in an organization to provide that reference letter. Then Afghans would have to be, they can't be in Afghanistan while their application is under process. They have to be in another country for 12 to 14 months while that's under process, which is a huge problem because it effectively is forcing them to become refugees again. And thirdly, almost no country is issuing Afghans visas. So where do they go? the program, while well-intentioned, bureaucratically, it's been very poorly designed. Thank you.
Thanks, Nishank. Unfortunately, we're almost at time. There's so much to follow up just on your answer alone. Najeeba, did you have some closing remarks? We will be finishing in 1 minute.
Yeah, maybe my probably closing remark would be to enable greater relevance and ownership. Again, I would say it's quite important that local actors are really given the space to define, contextualize and country-specific localization priorities and commitments. This can be managed again through a dedicated locally led mechanism, such as a working group positioned within each of these countries' humanitarian coordination structure. And I think, again, when we are to look at how Australia could become a champion again and lead its engagement in this process is look at what's doable. And I think if we've been able to support the minimum protection to those interpreters, we can do it again to women and girls. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Najeeba, and to all our panelists, and especially to Dan for facilitating today's session. We certainly will be following up with questions to the answers that you've all posed in the chat function. Some great questions in there. And I've had a comment from one of my colleagues at Aiden that it looks like we need to do a follow-up to this. So it's been a really important moment to pause and reflect on the quite horrifying situation that everyone's finding themselves in Afghanistan, and those in the wider diaspora network who may be living in Australia on temporary visas in fear that they'll be returned to harm, for example. So I'd like to thank you all very much for attending, and appreciate that there's many questions and we certainly will get to them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Anna.